A millionaire invited the cleaning lady to his wedding party with the intention of humiliating her. When she took the microphone, all the guests were left speechless. The small, cluttered apartment smelled of lavender and cleaning supplies. It was all Rose could afford after her husband, Charles, had walked out on them years ago. Beatrice sat cross-legged on the threadbare carpet, carefully stitching the hem of her only school uniform. Outside, the sound of children playing echoed through the narrow street. But Beatrice paid no attention. Her hands moved with practiced precision, her mind far away in a world where she didn't have to worry about threadbare clothes or overdue bills. "Bea, sweetie, come help me with the mop," Rose called from the kitchenette. Her voice carried the weight of exhaustion, yet there was a gentle warmth in it that never wavered. "Coming, Mom," Beatrice replied, setting her sewing aside. She tied her dark curls into a ponytail, rolled up her sleeves, and grabbed the mop. The bucket of soapy water sloshed as she dragged it across the room. At just 10 years old, Beatrice had already learned the value of hard work. Every morning before school, she helped her mother clean houses. By the time she arrived at class, her hands smelled faintly of bleach, and her shoes were damp from scrubbing floors. Yet, she never complained. "Mom, do you think one day I could go to college?" Beatrice asked as they scrubbed the kitchen tiles side by side. Rose paused, leaning on her mop. Her face, lined with years of struggle, softened as she looked at her daughter. "Of course you can be. You're smart, determined, and kind. The world can't ignore that forever." Beatrice smiled. She clung to her mother's words like a lifeline. Education was her dream. Her way out of this life of relentless toil. But the world was harsh and unkind. At school, the other kids teased her for her worn clothes and the faint scent of cleaning products that clung to her. "Mop girl," they'd sneer. Beatrice learned early on to keep her head down and ignore the taunts. Still, there were moments of escape. Beatrice loved to sing. At night, after the day's work was done, she would curl up on the couch with her mother, humming softly as Rose combed her hair. Her voice, pure and angelic, seemed to transport them both to a place far from their cramped apartment. "You've got a gift, Bea," Rose would say. "Don't ever stop singing." But Beatrice wasn't sure the world cared about her voice. What it seemed to care about was money, power, and appearances. All things she and her mother lacked. One particularly difficult day, Beatrice and Rose were cleaning the sprawling estate of the Harringtons, one of the wealthiest families in town. The house was a palace compared to their tiny apartment, with glittering chandeliers, plush carpets, and walls lined with expensive artwork. As Beatrice dusted a grand piano in the corner of the living room, her fingers brushed the keys. A soft note rang out, and for a moment she couldn't resist. She sat down and played a melody she remembered from church. Her voice rose tentatively, blending with the piano's haunting tune. "Who's singing?" came a sharp voice. Mrs. Harrington, draped in pearls and indignation, entered the room. "This isn't a concert hall. Get back to work." Beatrice flushed with embarrassment and stammered an apology. That night, as they walked home, Rose squeezed her daughter's hand. "Don't let them make you feel small, Bea. You have something special, and one day the world will see it." As the years passed, Beatrice grew into a determined young woman. She balanced her studies with her cleaning jobs, always striving to make her mother proud. Rose's health began to decline, and the weight of their struggles pressed harder on Beatrice's shoulders. Still, she held on to her dreams. In quiet moments, she sang to herself, imagining a life where her voice could be her escape. One day, as she walked home from school, she passed by a group of girls whispering and giggling. "Did you hear Mr. Andrew Collins is hosting a charity gala at his mansion?" One said. "Only the richest people in town will be there." Andrew Collins was a name everyone knew. He was the town's most successful businessman. Known for his wealth and ruthless demeanor, Beatrice had never met him, but she knew people like him. Those who looked down on others like her and her mother. She didn't dwell on it, though. She had more pressing concerns, like the rising rent and Rose's medication costs as she climbed the stairs to their apartment. Beatrice paused, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there was a better life, waiting for her. "I'll find it, Mom," she whispered. For us, inside, Rose was waiting with a warm smile, dinner ready on the table. Beatrice joined her, the weight of the day melting away in her mother's presence. No matter how hard things got, They always had each other, and that, Beatrice knew, was more valuable than any fortune. The morning sun streamed through the cracked window, casting soft streaks of light across the worn linoleum floor. Beatrice stood in front of the small mirror by the door, adjusting the collar of her neatly pressed blouse. The fabric was thin and a little faded, but she made sure it was clean and presentable. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Bea?" Rose asked from the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped her coffee. The shadows under her eyes betrayed the sleepless nights filled with worry. "I'm ready, Mom," Beatrice replied with a confident smile, though her stomach twisted with nerves. "It's just a job, nothing I can't handle." Rose set down her cup and walked over, brushing a stray curl from Beatrice's forehead. "Remember, you're worth more than any paycheck. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Beatrice nodded. "I know, Mom." With a final squeeze of her mother's hand, she grabbed her bag and stepped out the door. The cool breeze of early morning filled her lungs, carrying the scent of wet pavement and fresh-baked bread from the bakery down the street. The city buzzed with the usual clamor of honking cars, street vendors, and people rushing to their jobs. As she walked, Beatrice rehearsed the instructions she'd been given. The Collins mansion was on the wealthier side of town, a neighborhood where houses sprawled across lush green lawns and high gates separated the privileged from everyone else. She took a deep breath as she approached the wrought iron gate with its intricate patterns and gold accents. A security guard glanced at her suspiciously. "Name: Beatrice Flores," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The guard checked a list, nodded, and waved her through. The path leading to the house was lined with manicured bushes and fountains that sprayed water in graceful arcs. The mansion itself was massive, with marble columns, expansive windows, and a grand entrance that seemed to loom over her. Beatrice's shoes barely made a sound on the polished tiles as she stepped inside. The interior was even more opulent. Chandeliers hung like crystal waterfalls, and priceless art adorned the walls. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon polish. A stern woman in a gray uniform approached, her eyes scanning Beatrice from head to toe. "You must be the new girl. I'm Mrs. Whitaker, the head housekeeper. You'll be assigned to cleaning the east wing. Mr. Collins expects everything to be immaculate. No mistakes." "Yes, ma'am," Beatrice said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Mrs. Whitaker handed her a cleaning kit and nodded toward the hallway. "Get to it then, and remember, keep out of the way." Beatrice nodded and set off down the gleaming corridor. The mansion seemed to stretch on forever, each room more lavish than the last. As she dusted and scrubbed, she couldn't help but marvel at the luxury. Crystal vases, velvet drapes, and imported rugs, all symbols of a life so far removed from her own. In the middle of cleaning a large study, she paused to look at the rows of leather-bound books lining the shelves. She traced a finger along the spines, wondering what kind of knowledge and stories they held. For a brief moment, she imagined herself as a student, immersed in books, free from the weight of survival. "Are you planning to read them or clean them?" A cold voice snapped from behind her. She spun around to see a tall man in a sharp suit, his expression one of barely concealed disdain. Andrew Collins. His dark eyes bore into her, assessing and dismissing her in the same glance. "Sorry, sir," she said quickly, lowering her gaze. "I was just wasting time," he finished for her. "I don't pay you to dawdle." Her cheeks burned, but she nodded and returned to her task. He turned and walked away without another word, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. She exhaled slowly, steadying her trembling hands. "Don't let him get to you," she thought. "You're here to work, not to be liked." The hours passed in a blur of dusting, scrubbing, and polishing. The mansion felt like a maze, its grandeur suffocating. But Beatrice pushed through, determined to prove herself. She thought of her mother, of the bills stacked on the kitchen table, of the dreams that refused to die, no matter how hard life tried to smother them. When the clock finally struck 6, she wiped her forehead and headed back to the servants' quarters. Mrs. Whitaker gave her a curt nod of approval. "Not bad for your first day. Be back tomorrow at 7 sharp." "Yes, ma'am," Beatrice replied. Her feet ached, and exhaustion weighed her down, but a small sense of accomplishment flickered in her chest. As she walked home, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the city. The streets were quieter now, the rush of the day giving way to the hum of evening. Beatrice let the cool air wash over her, grateful that she had survived the first day. When she reached the apartment, Rose was waiting by the door. Worry etched into her face. "How did it go?" Beatrice smiled, though her muscles protested. "I made it through." Rose hugged her tightly, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. No matter how difficult things got, they had each other, and that, Beatrice knew, was the strongest foundation she could ever stand on. Beatrice's second day at the Collins mansion started early. The morning chill bit at her fingers as she clutched her cleaning supplies, walking briskly to the grand entrance. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the scent of expensive wood polish and freshly cut flowers filling her lungs. Mrs. Whitaker was already waiting, clipboard in hand, her sharp eyes narrowed. "You're on time." "Good. Today, you'll be focusing on the main hall and the adjacent rooms. Mr. Collins likes things spotless. No smudges on the glass, no streaks on the floor." "Yes, ma'am," Beatrice said, nodding as she walked toward the main hall. The vastness of the room struck her again. The marble floor shone under the sunlight, filtering through tall windows. Gilded mirrors reflected the grandeur of the space, making it feel like it stretched on forever. Beatrice tightened her grip on the mop handle and got to work, the rhythm of her movements almost meditative. She was wiping down the ornate banister when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The air seemed to shift, a cold edge replacing the warmth of the sun. "What are you doing?" Andrew's voice sliced through the silence, cold and demanding. "Cleaning the banister." "Sir," Beatrice replied, keeping her voice even. He crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly, a smirk playing on his lips. "I can see that. I meant, why are you doing it so slowly? Time is money, and clearly you have none to waste." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look up. "I'm making sure it's done properly." "Sir," Andrew let out a dry laugh. "Properly? A smear-free banister isn't going to change your life." She bit the inside of her cheek, willing herself not to respond. His words stung, each one a reminder of the gap between their worlds. He didn't know anything about her, yet he spoke as though her life's worth was measured by the speed of her mop. He stepped closer, his polished shoes gleaming. "People like you waste too much time on pointless details. You'll never get ahead that way." For a moment, the urge to defend herself flared, but she swallowed it down. Instead, she looked him straight in the eyes, surprising even herself with her calm. "I believe good work matters, no matter who's doing it." Something flickered in Andrew's gaze, but it was gone before she could place it. He scoffed and turned away. "Suit yourself. Just stay out of my way." The echo of his footsteps faded as he walked off, leaving her alone with the bitterness of his words. She exhaled slowly, the sting of humiliation settling deep in her chest. "Don't let him break you," she reminded herself. "You're here for a reason." The rest of the day was a blur of cleaning, her body moving on autopilot as her mind replayed the encounter. She couldn't understand how someone could be so dismissive, so full of contempt for people who worked hard. Did he think his wealth made him better than everyone else? At lunchtime, Beatrice took her break in a small, dimly lit room reserved for the staff. She ate quietly, the plain sandwich tasting like cardboard. The other employees chatted amongst themselves. But Beatrice kept to herself. She was used to being an outsider. As she stood to return to work, a soft voice stopped her. "Don't let him get to you." She turned to see Marcy, one of the maids, giving her a sympathetic smile. Marcy was in her 40s with kind eyes and a streak of gray in her dark hair. "He's always like that," Marcy continued. "Thinks the world revolves around him. Don't take it personally." Beatrice managed a small smile. "Thanks, Marcy. Keep your head down and do your job. It's the only way to survive here," Marcy said, patting her shoulder before walking away. Beatrice returned to the main hall, Marcy's words echoing in her mind. She tried to focus on her tasks, but Andrew's disdain clung to her like a shadow. By late afternoon, she was exhausted. Her arms ached from scrubbing, and her back protested every time she bent over. But the hall gleamed, every surface reflecting her hard work. She was gathering her supplies when she heard Andrew's voice again. This time from the hallway, he was talking to someone on the phone, his tone sharp and impatient. "I don't care what it costs," he snapped. "Just make sure everything is perfect for the gala. I won't tolerate incompetence." He stepped into the hall, still talking, and his eyes landed on Beatrice. His gaze was dismissive, as though she were part of the furniture, She lowered her eyes, focusing on the mop in her hands. "Some people just don't understand standards," he said loudly, clearly aiming the comment at her. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. When he finally walked away, she let out a shaky breath. The weight of the day pressed on her shoulders, but she refused to crumble. As she walked home that evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. The city lights began to flicker on, each one a tiny beacon of hope. She thought of her mother waiting for her, of the dreams she carried in her heart. Andrew's words had tried to chip away at her resolve, but they hadn't broken her. She was more than his disdain, more than the life he thought she was trapped in. Her worth wasn't defined by his opinion. One day, she thought, I'll prove that my work and my dreams matter. The days at the Collins mansion blurred together as Beatrice settled into her new routine. Mornings were spent polishing marble floors and dusting ornate furniture, afternoons scrubbing windows until they gleamed, and evenings ensuring every corner of the vast house was immaculate. The work was physically demanding, but Beatrice poured herself into it, determined to do her best. She often thought of her mother, whose sacrifices inspired her to keep pushing forward. Still, there were moments of reprieve, tiny cracks in the monotonous rhythm of her days. When no one was around, Beatrice would let her voice drift softly through the empty rooms. Singing brought her solace, a small joy in an otherwise grueling routine. She sang for herself, not expecting anyone to listen. One quiet afternoon, Beatrice found herself in the grand library, dusting the towering bookshelves. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the room's rich mahogany furniture and rows of leather-bound volumes. It was her favorite space in the mansion, a haven of calm amidst the chaos. As she worked, her gaze fell on the grand piano in the corner. Its glossy surface gleamed in the sunlight, and her fingers itched to touch the keys. She glanced around to make sure she was alone before approaching it cautiously. The piano seemed almost sacred, a piece of art as much as an instrument. Beatrice sat on the bench, running her fingers lightly over the keys. She pressed one, and the note rang out, pure and clear. A shiver ran down her spine. Her hands moved instinctively, playing a melody she'd learned as a child. Then, without thinking, she began to sing. Her voice filled the library, soft at first, then growing stronger. It was a song about hope and resilience, one her mother used to hum when things got tough. The melody wrapped around her, lifting her out of the mansion and into a world where her dreams felt tangible. Unbeknownst to her, Andrew had entered the room. He had been passing by when the sound of the piano stopped him in his tracks. At first, he thought someone had left the radio on, but as he stepped closer, he realized the voice was live and unmistakably beautiful. Andrew stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as Beatrice lost herself in the music. Her voice was angelic, each note dripping with raw emotion. For a moment, he was captivated. It was a side of her he hadn't imagined, a depth that didn't fit the image of the timid cleaning girl he'd dismissed so easily when Beatrice finished the song. Her fingers lingered on the keys, a soft sigh escaping her lips. She turned to gather her cleaning supplies and froze when she saw Andrew leaning against the doorframe. Her heart leapt into her throat. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, standing quickly. "I didn't mean to. Who said you could touch the piano?" His tone was sharp, but there was a hint of something else, something he himself didn't understand. Curiosity, maybe. "I was just cleaning it," she said, though the words sounded weak even to her. Andrew raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing. "Cleaning it with a song." Her cheeks burned. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. "You sing well," he said bluntly, "but this isn't a concert hall. You're here to clean, not to entertain." The compliment, if it could be called that, did little to ease her embarrassment. Beatrice lowered her gaze, muttering another apology before gathering her supplies and rushing out of the room. Andrew watched her leave, a frown tugging at his lips. He told himself it didn't matter. She was just a housekeeper. Her voice, no matter how extraordinary, had no place in his life. And yet, he couldn't shake the haunting melody from his mind. Beatrice, meanwhile, berated herself as she hurried down the hall. She had let her guard down, and now Andrew had even more reason to look down on her. She resolved to stay invisible from now on, to keep her head down and focus solely on her work. That evening, as she walked home, the embarrassment lingered, but so did a small flicker of pride. She thought of how the piano keys had felt beneath her fingers, how her voice had filled the library. For a brief moment, she had allowed herself to dream again. When she got home, Rose was waiting as always, her smile a balm for Beatrice's frayed nerves. They sat together at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal. Beatrice didn't mention what had happened at the mansion. She didn't want to worry her mother. Instead, she hummed softly as they cleaned up, her voice light and carefree. Rose looked at her with a knowing smile. Whatever it is you're holding back, Bea, just remember, your voice is a gift. Don't be afraid to use it. Beatrice nodded, though she wasn't sure how. Her mother had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. But in a world that valued wealth and status above all else, she wondered if her voice could ever truly matter. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, Beatrice made a silent promise to herself. No matter how much Andrew Collins tried to diminish her, she wouldn't let him extinguish the small spark of hope she carried. Her voice was hers, and no amount of disdain could take that away. The days crawled by in a monotonous rhythm, each one blending into the next. Beatrice worked diligently, her every movement precise and careful. The grand halls of the Collins mansion no longer intimidated her the way they once did. She had learned to keep her head down, to ignore the sneers and dismissive glances, and to find small victories in a job well done. But the encounter in the library haunted her. Andrew's sharp words echoed in her mind, chipping away at her confidence. Though he had grudgingly acknowledged her voice, his disdain overshadowed any flicker of pride she might have felt. She kept her singing to herself now, letting her voice out only in the quiet of her apartment, where no one could judge her. It was on one of those dreary afternoons, while she polished the enormous crystal chandelier in the main hall, that she overheard Danielle's laughter. The sound was light and artificial, like glass beads clinking together. Beatrice glanced down and saw Danielle, draped in an expensive silk dress, arm in arm with Andrew as they descended the sweeping staircase. "Everything must be perfect for the gala," Danielle was saying, her voice dripping with entitlement. "It's the event of the season, after all." Andrew nodded, his expression as cold and detached as always. "I don't tolerate anything less than perfection." Danielle's eyes flicked to Beatrice, a sly smile curving her painted lips. "Oh look, even the help is hard at work." Her tone made the word help sound like a slur. Beatrice kept her gaze fixed on the chandelier, her hands steady as she wiped the glass prisms. She'd gotten used to their jabs, but each one still left a sting. Andrew's voice broke the silence. "Beatrice." Her shoulders stiffened. He rarely addressed her by name. She turned slowly, clutching the cloth in her hands. "Yes, sir. We're hosting a gala this weekend," he said, his eyes cold and unreadable. "We'd like you to attend." The words took a moment to register. Beatrice blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Attend, sir?" Danielle laughed, the sound grating. "Yes, you heard correctly. Andrew thinks it would be educational for you to see how real society behaves." Beatrice's stomach twisted. She could hear the mockery laced in the invitation, the cruel game they were playing. Her first instinct was to refuse, to walk away with her dignity intact. But a flicker of defiance sparked inside her. Why shouldn't she go? Why should she let their contempt push her into the shadows? "Thank you for the invitation," she said, her voice even. "I'll be there." Andrew's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Good, don't disappoint us." As they walked away, Danielle's laughter floated behind them, a dagger aimed straight at Beatrice's pride. She stood there for a moment, the chandelier above her casting fractured rainbows onto the polished floor. The weight of their cruelty settled over her, but beneath it, a resolve began to form. That evening, Beatrice told her mother about the invitation as they sat at the kitchen table, the glow from the single bulb above casting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. "You don't have to go, Bea," Rose said, worry etched into her face. "It sounds like a trap." "I know," Beatrice admitted, staring at her hands. "But if I don't go, they win. They'll think I'm afraid. I'm tired of being afraid." Rose reached across the table, her fingers wrapping around Beatrice's. You've got nothing to prove to them." "Sweetheart, it's not about proving anything to them," Beatrice said softly. "It's about proving something to myself." Her mother nodded slowly, pride and fear warring in her eyes. "Then go. Hold your head high." The days leading up to the gala were a whirlwind of doubt and determination. Beatrice had no fancy dress, no sparkling jewelry. Their neighbors, hearing of the invitation, pooled together what they could. Mrs. Ramirez, who lived in the apartment next door, lent her a simple, powder blue dress that had once belonged to her daughter. It was worn but clean, and when Beatrice tried it on, it fit like it had been made for her. On the night of the gala, Rose helped Beatrice pin her curls back, leaving a few loose strands to frame her face. She smoothed the dress over Beatrice's shoulders, tears shimmering in her eyes. "You look beautiful," Rose whispered. "Don't let them take this from you." Beatrice swallowed hard and nodded. "I won't." She took a final look in the cracked mirror. The girl staring back at her wasn't a wealthy socialite or a pampered guest. She was herself, strong, resilient, and determined not to let anyone diminish her worth. The Collins mansion glittered with lights as she approached, the windows glowing with the warmth of a world she had never been part of. Laughter and music spilled out into the night, mingling with the hum of expensive cars pulling up to the grand entrance. Beatrice's heart pounded as she walked up the steps. Her scuffed shoes felt out of place against the red carpet, but she forced herself to keep going. The doorman barely glanced at her as he opened the door, and she stepped inside. The main hall had been transformed. Chandeliers sparkled like constellations, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. Men in tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns moved through the room, their laughter high and brittle. Beatrice felt the eyes on her immediately. Whispers slithered through the crowd, followed by amused glances and poorly concealed smirks. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe. "Glad you could make it," Andrew's voice drawled. She turned to see him standing nearby, a glass of champagne in his hand. He looked impeccable, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his eyes cold and calculating. Danielle was at his side, her smile predatory. "You look quaint," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Beatrice lifted her chin, refusing to flinch. "Thank you for the invitation." Andrew's lips curled. "Oh, the night is just beginning." As they moved away, she felt a chill run down her spine. She knew they were setting her up for something, but whatever it was, she would face it head on. She had come too far to turn back now. The morning after the invitation, Beatrice woke up with a weight in her chest. The memory of Andrew's cold smirk and Danielle's mocking laughter played on a loop in her mind. She lay still for a moment, staring at the cracked ceiling, doubt creeping in. What if they're right? What if this is just a cruel joke? But another voice, quieter yet stronger, whispered back, "You've faced worse. You can face this too." She swung her legs off the bed and stood, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about attending a party. It was about showing herself, and them, that she was more than they believed her to be. She didn't need their approval. She only needed her own courage. In the kitchen, the scent of coffee and toast greeted her. Rose was at the stove, her thin shoulders hunched as she flipped a pancake. She turned, giving Beatrice a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," Rose said, her voice soft. "Did you sleep okay?" Beatrice nodded, though her restless night told a different story. "I did, and I'm going to the gala, Mom. I've decided." Rose set the spatula down and sighed. "I know you have. Just promise me you'll be careful, these people. They don't play fair." "I know," Beatrice said, "but I can't let them intimidate me. Not anymore." Rose reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "I'm so proud of you, Bea. No matter what happens, you hold your head high. You hear me?" "I will," Beatrice promised. After breakfast, she set out to prepare. There wasn't much time, and even less money, but that didn't stop her. The dress Mrs. Ramirez had lent her hung carefully on the back of the bedroom door, a simple powder blue garment with a modest neckline and a hem that fell just below her knees. It wasn't extravagant, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. She ran her fingers over the fabric, taking in the soft texture. It wasn't the dress she'd imagined wearing to a grand event, but it carried with it the kindness of neighbors who believed in her, and that made it priceless. She spent the afternoon carefully washing the dress by hand, the cold water biting at her fingers. When it was clean and hanging to dry, she turned her attention to her shoes. They were her best pair, black flats that had seen better days. She scrubbed them until they shone, the leather soft and worn but clean. Later, she sat on the edge of her bed, a small mirror propped against the wall. She brushed her dark curls until they were smooth and soft, pinning them back with a few hairpins she'd found in the bottom of a drawer. A few tendrils escaped, framing her face gently. She didn't have makeup beyond a tube of lip balm, but when she looked at herself in the mirror, she realized she didn't need it. Her skin, though tired from long days of work, glowed with a quiet strength. Her eyes, dark and steady, held a determination that no amount of ridicule could erase. "Bea?" Rose's voice called from the doorway. She turned to see her mother standing there, eyes misty with emotion. "Oh, sweetheart," Rose whispered. "You look beautiful." Beatrice smiled, a mix of nerves and hope fluttering in her chest. "It's just a dress." "No," Rose said firmly. "It's more than that. It's dignity. It's strength." Beatrice stood and hugged her mother tightly, drawing strength from the embrace. "I'm ready." The evening arrived faster than she expected. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Beatrice's heart pounded as she made her way to the Collins mansion. The borrowed dress felt light against her skin, and her worn shoes made soft taps against the pavement. As she neared the grand gates, the sounds of music and laughter grew louder. The lights of the mansion twinkled like stars, casting a warm glow over the manicured lawn. Luxury cars lined the driveway, their polished surfaces reflecting the glow of the chandeliers inside. She paused for a moment, gathering her courage. "You belong here as much as anyone else," she reminded herself. With a deep breath, she walked through the gate and up the wide steps. The doorman glanced at her with mild disinterest, barely nodding as he opened the door. She stepped inside, the hum of conversation and the clink of crystal glasses washing over her. The grand hall was alive with color and movement. Women in shimmering gowns glided across the marble floor, their laughter like wind chimes. Men in sharp tuxedos stood in small clusters, talking in low, serious tones. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, wine, and wealth. Beatrice took a step forward, her palms damp. The eyes of the guests flicked toward her, assessing her in an instant before sliding away, some with amusement, others with outright disdain. Whispers trailed behind her like phantom hands, tugging at her confidence. But she didn't stop. She walked further into the room, her spine straight and her chin lifted. The dress, though simple, moved gracefully with her steps. The shoes, though worn, carried her with quiet pride. "Ah, there you are." Andrew's voice sliced through the noise. He stood near the bar, a glass of champagne in his hand, his dark eyes gleaming with something that made her stomach twist. Danielle was beside him, her smile sharp and predatory. Beatrice met Andrew's gaze, refusing to flinch. "I'm here, just like you asked." His lips curled into a cold smile. "Good. The night is full of surprises." Danielle leaned closer to him, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "I hope you enjoy yourself, Beatrice," she said, her voice sugar-sweet. "After all, we went through so much trouble to make sure you fit in." Beatrice's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "I'm sure I will." She turned away before they could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Her heart pounded, but she focused on the steady rhythm of her breath. Whatever they had planned, she wouldn't let them break her. She was here, and she wasn't going to run. The grand hall sparkled with opulence. Chandeliers glittered overhead, casting golden light across the marble floor. The walls were lined with tall mirrors, reflecting the swirl of gowns, the glint of jewels, and the polished shoes of men who seemed to glide rather than walk. The air buzzed with idle chatter and tinkling laughter, each sound dripping with privilege and pretense. Beatrice took a steadying breath. The powder blue dress, simple yet elegant, clung to her like armor. She knew she stood out, not for her elegance, but for the lack of extravagance in her attire. The eyes of the guests lingered on her, their glances laced with curiosity, amusement, and thinly veiled disdain. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes, and she instinctively stepped aside to let him through, earning a sharp glare from a woman in a sequined gown. "Watch where you're going," the woman snapped, as if Beatrice had committed a crime just by existing in her space. This was a mistake, she thought, doubt clawing at her confidence. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of judgment pressing down on her. "Lost, are we?" The voice was a syrupy drawl, and Beatrice turned to see Danielle standing just a few feet away. Her gown, a deep crimson that hugged her figure, shimmered under the lights. Her smile was all teeth, a predator's smile masked in charm. Beatrice straightened her spine. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Danielle's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Oh, I doubt that, but it's cute that you think so." A few other guests nearby chuckled softly, their eyes gleaming with shared amusement. The laughter sliced through Beatrice like a blade, but she refused to let it show. "Danielle." Andrew's voice was smooth as he approached, his dark suit impeccable, his gaze cold and detached. "You're not scaring off our guest, are you?" Danielle pouted, feigning innocence. "I wouldn't dream of it." Andrew's eyes landed on Beatrice, the corner of his mouth twitching in what could barely be called a smile. "You seem uncomfortable. Perhaps this was too much for you." Her jaw clenched, but she managed to keep her voice even. "I'm fine, thank you." He studied her, his gaze calculating as if weighing her worth. "Good, because the night is far from over." Before she could respond, the band struck up a lively tune. Couples flowed onto the dance floor, the room a blur of color and movement. Beatrice felt more isolated than ever, a single still point in a sea of motion. "Dance with me," Andrew said suddenly, holding out his hand. Her eyes widened. "What?" A few heads turned, whispers flaring up like sparks. Danielle's eyes narrowed, her expression darkening. "Andrew, you can't be serious." His gaze remained locked on Beatrice. "I insist." Every instinct told her to refuse. This was another game, another trap, but she could feel the eyes of the room on her, the pressure to shrink, to disappear. Instead, she took a deep breath and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm and cold. He led her onto the dance floor, the crowd parting like water. The music swelled, a waltz that felt both beautiful and suffocating. He placed his other hand on her waist, and she rested hers on his shoulder, the fabric of his suit smooth beneath her fingers. They began to move. He guided her effortlessly, his steps precise and practiced. Beatrice forced herself to follow, her feet uncertain but determined. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. "You surprise me," he said, his voice low. "I didn't think you'd accept." "I don't scare easily," she replied, meeting his eyes. His lips twitched again, that almost smile. "We'll see about that." As they danced, she could feel the weight of the room's attention. Whispers swirled around them, each one a needle pricking her skin. Is she serious? A maid dancing with Andrew Collins. How absurd. She doesn't belong here. The words cut deep, but she refused to let them draw blood. Instead, she focused on the rhythm, on the feel of the floor beneath her feet. She wouldn't let them break her spirit. Andrew leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How does it feel, being the center of attention?" She lifted her chin. "I'd rather be ignored than be the butt of a joke." His eyes flickered with something she couldn't identify. Curiosity, maybe, or a hint of guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You're tougher than you look." "I have to be." The song ended, and he released her hand. Stepping back, a smattering of applause filled the room, polite but hollow. As they left the dance floor, Danielle was waiting, her smile razor-sharp. "Lovely performance," she purred. "But I think the entertainment portion is over." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Beatrice turned to walk away, the weight of humiliation settling over her. But Andrew wasn't done. He stepped forward, taking the microphone from the bandstand. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the hall, commanding attention. "Before we continue, I'd like to invite someone special to say a few words." Beatrice froze. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and calculating. "Beatrice," he said, his voice silky smooth. "Come up here. Don't be shy." The room went silent. All eyes turned to her, the collective gaze like a spotlight pinning her in place. Her mouth went dry, her heart pounding like a drum. This is it, she realized. The trap. Danielle's laughter bubbled up behind her, cruel and triumphant. She had two choices, flee and give them the satisfaction, or face them with her head held high. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself forward, each step echoing in the silence. She took the microphone from Andrew's outstretched hand, his smirk a dagger to her pride. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but instead, she did the one thing they never expected. She took a deep breath and began to sing. The microphone felt heavy in Beatrice's trembling hands. The grand hall was a sea of silent faces, each pair of eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to crumble. The chandelier's golden light gleamed like a spotlight, trapping her in place. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the anticipation of her humiliation, Andrew's cold smirk, Danielle's malicious grin, the amused expressions of the wealthy guests. They all wanted the same thing, for her to fail, to flee, to prove she didn't belong. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might drown out the silence. Her throat felt tight, dry, but somewhere deep inside, a flicker of defiance sparked. She thought of her mother's words that morning. "Hold your head high. I've faced worse than this." She closed her eyes, took a slow, deep breath, and let the fear slip away. When she opened them, her gaze was steady, her voice clear. She began to sing. The first note was soft, almost fragile, like a thread of glass, but it held, unwavering. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Her voice rose gently, growing stronger with each word, each note. It was a song of hope and resilience, one her mother used to sing when the weight of the world felt too heavy. The melody wrapped around her like a shield, protecting her from the sneers and the smirks. The grand hall, so often filled with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and music, now seemed frozen in time. Beatrice's voice flowed through the air, a river of raw emotion. It was pure, unfiltered. Her very soul poured into every note, the pain, the struggle, the quiet dignity she carried through each day. It all found a voice. The guests were transfixed. Some lowered their glasses. Others stopped mid-conversation. Eyes that had been mocking turned wide with surprise, with something that almost looked like shame. Andrew's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to understand what he was hearing. Danielle's smile stiffened, a flicker of uncertainty passing over her face. Beatrice sang not for them, but for herself, for the girl who had scrubbed floors before school, for the mother who never stopped believing, for the neighbors who lent her their kindness. This was her moment, her truth, and no amount of cruelty could take it from her. When she reached the final note, her voice soared, clear and unwavering before fading gently into silence. The hall remained still, as if no one dared to breathe. The echo of her song hung in the air, a ghost of something beautiful and unbreakable. She lowered the microphone slowly, her hands no longer shaking. She had done it. She had faced the storm and stood tall. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, a single clap broke it. Soft, hesitant. Beatrice's eyes darted to the side, where an older woman in an emerald gown was clapping, her expression one of quiet awe. The sound grew, another clap joining, then another. It swelled into a wave of applause, rolling through the room like a tide. Some guests clapped politely, others with genuine admiration. A few even wiped at their eyes, touched by the honesty of her performance. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was real, and that was enough. Beatrice's heart swelled. She had done more than survive. She had shined. She met Andrew's gaze, his expression unreadable. The man who had invited her here to humiliate her now looked like he didn't know what to do with himself. Danielle's face was a storm cloud, her eyes cold and furious, her lips curled, and she leaned toward Andrew, whispering something sharp and cutting. He didn't respond, his gaze still locked on Beatrice. Jack Mitchell, a well-known music producer, stepped forward. His salt and pepper hair caught the light, and his eyes gleamed with interest. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice low but firm. "What's your name?" "Young lady." "Beatrice," she replied, her voice steady. "Well, Beatrice, I'd like to talk to you about a future in music if you're interested." Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Was this real? An actual opportunity? She managed a nod, her cheeks flushing. I'd love that." Jack smiled warmly. "I'll find you before the evening's over." He moved back into the crowd, leaving Beatrice stunned. The applause had died down, but the air buzzed with curiosity and surprise. Whispers floated around her. Who is she? Where did she come from? She's incredible. Andrew cleared his throat, drawing her attention. He stepped forward, his expression strained, as though the muscles in his face were fighting against him. That was unexpected, he said. Good, she replied, her voice firm. I'm glad to surprise you. Something flickered in his eyes, but she didn't care to find out what it was. She turned away, her head held high. For the first time, she felt like she was walking on solid ground, each step sure and steady. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need Danielle's acceptance. Their world was not hers, and that was perfectly fine. As she walked toward the edge of the room, Marcy, the kind maid, caught her eye and gave her a discreet thumbs up. Beatrice smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. She had come to this gala expecting the worst. Instead, she had found her voice. Her dignity remained intact, shining brighter than any chandelier. As Beatrice walked off the stage, her heart still raced. But it was no longer out of fear. The applause had faded, replaced by the murmurs of confused and astonished guests. She felt the heat of their eyes on her back, each gaze weighing her down, but she refused to shrink under it. Instead, she carried herself with quiet pride, her chin lifted, her step steady. The room's opulence felt less suffocating now, as though her song had carved out a small space of freedom in a world that had always tried to push her aside. She took a deep breath, the air no longer feeling like it was trying to choke her. Marcy caught her eye from across the room, giving her a subtle nod of encouragement. Beatrice smiled, the gesture small but genuine. That one look reminded her that she wasn't alone. Even in this cold, gleaming world, there were people who saw her, who believed in her. As she reached the edge of the grand hall, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned, half expecting another sneer or cutting remark. But instead, she met the warm eyes of Jack Mitchell, the music producer who had approached her earlier. Up close, his face was lined with experience, but his eyes held a youthful spark of enthusiasm. Beatrice, he said, his voice steady and sincere. I meant what I said earlier. Your voice is something special. Her breath caught, disbelief flickering across her face. Thank you, she whispered. The words felt too small for the magnitude of the moment. He smiled, a gentle, reassuring curve of his lips. I want to help you develop it. You have talent that deserves to be heard. The weight of his words settled on her shoulders. Both thrilling and terrifying, this was more than just praise. It was an opportunity, one that had always felt out of reach. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Don't be afraid to use your gift. I'd love that, she said finally, her voice stronger now. Good. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek business card. Call me tomorrow. We can talk more then. She took the card, the embossed letters smooth under her fingers. For the first time in a long while, hope didn't feel like a fragile thing. It felt real, tangible. Thank you, she said again, this time with a smile that lit up her whole face. Jack nodded, then slipped back into the crowd, leaving her standing at the edge of possibility. She clutched the card tightly, as though afraid it might disappear if she let go. The moment of triumph was short-lived. As she turned to leave, she saw Andrew standing a few feet away, his gaze locked on her. His face was unreadable, the usual smugness absent. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other. You're full of surprises, he said, his voice low. She tilted her head slightly, meeting his eyes without flinching. Maybe you're just bad at seeing people for who they are. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. He looked as though he wanted to say something, but the walls he had built around himself held firm. She shook her head. I don't need your approval, Andrew. His eyes darkened, something resembling regret flickering in them. I never said you did. She didn't wait for more. Whatever he wanted to say, it didn't matter. His opinion was just one more shadow in a room full of them. She turned away, the weight of his gaze slipping off her like a discarded coat. She moved toward the exit, the noise of the gala receding behind her. The cold night air greeted her as she stepped outside, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the hall. It felt like a cleansing breath, a new beginning. The world outside was dark, but it was honest. No pretense, no gilded edges, just the steady hum of the city and the soft glow of streetlights. Beatrice inhaled deeply, the air filling her lungs with a sense of freedom. Her mother's face appeared in her mind's eye, and she smiled. Rose had always believed in her, even when Beatrice struggled to believe in herself. This victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to both of them. As she started down the steps, she heard footsteps behind her. "Beatrice," a familiar voice called her. She turned to see Marcy, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You okay, kiddo?" Beatrice nodded. "Yeah, I am." Marcy smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You were amazing in there. Don't let anyone take that away from you." "I won't," Beatrice promised. They walked together toward the street, the mansion behind them fading into the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, Beatrice's steps felt light, unburdened. The future stretched out before her, uncertain but filled with possibility. Her fingers brushed against the card in her pocket, a reminder of the door that had opened, the chance she never thought she'd get. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't afraid anymore. The city lights flickered like stars as Beatrice walked home, her fingers still wrapped tightly around Jack Mitchell's business card. The cold night air nipped at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Each step felt lighter, as though she'd shed a layer of doubt that had weighed her down for years. Marcy walked beside her, her sensible shoes tapping against the sidewalk. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "I've worked in that mansion for 15 years and I've never seen anyone do what you did tonight." Beatrice smiled faintly. "It wasn't easy. It never is," Marcy replied, her tone gentle. "But you did it anyway. That's what matters." They reached the intersection where their paths diverged. Marcy paused, her eyes searching Beatrice's face. "You're going to call him, right? The producer?" Beatrice glanced at the card in her hand. The name Jack Mitchell printed in bold, confident letters. The weight of the decision settled over her. It wasn't just a phone call. It was a door opening to a life she'd never dared to imagine. "I think so," she said quietly. Marcy nodded. "Good. You've got a gift, Bea. Don't waste it." "I won't," she promised, a surge of determination rising in her chest. Marcy gave her a quick hug. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a new day." Beatrice watched as Marcy disappeared into the night, then turned toward home. The street was quiet, the hum of distant traffic the only sound. She climbed the worn steps to the apartment and slipped inside, the familiar creak of the door welcoming her back. The living room was dimly lit, a small lamp casting a warm glow. Rose was waiting on the couch, her eyes anxious but hopeful. She sat up straighter when she saw Beatrice. "How did it go?" Rose asked, her voice trembling slightly. Beatrice walked over and sank onto the couch beside her mother. She held out the business card, her hands finally steady. "It went well, Mom. A producer offered to help me. He thinks I can make something of my singing." Rose's eyes filled with tears, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh, Bea, I knew it. I knew you could do it." Beatrice leaned into her mother's embrace, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up to her. "I was so scared, Mom. I thought they'd laugh me off the stage. But you didn't let them," Rose whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. "You stood your ground. That's what courage is." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the evening settling into something softer, something hopeful. The world outside their window was still the same, but everything felt different now. A door had opened, a real, tangible opportunity. Eventually, Rose pulled back, wiping her eyes. "When do you call him?" "Tomorrow," Beatrice said. "He wants to talk about next steps." Her mother nodded, pride shining through her tears. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart. Whatever it takes, we'll make it work." Morning sunlight streamed through the window, the warmth a gentle nudge to wake up. Beatrice stretched, the stiffness of the night melting away. The events of the gala rushed back to her, and for a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. But the business card was still on the nightstand, the black letters sharp and real. She picked it up, feeling its weight in her palm. This is real. This is happening. In the kitchen, Rose was humming softly as she brewed coffee. She turned and smiled. "Morning, Bea." "Morning, Mom. Ready to make that call?" Rose asked, handing her a steaming mug. Beatrice took a sip, the warmth settling her nerves. "Yeah, I'm ready." She sat at the small kitchen table, the phone in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the keypad. doubt flickering for just a second. What if this doesn't work out? What if I'm not good enough? But she shook the thoughts away. She'd come too far to back down now. With a deep breath, she dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Jack Mitchell speaking? Hi, Mr. Mitchell. This is Beatrice Flores. Beatrice. His voice lit up with enthusiasm. I'm glad you called. I was hoping you would. Her heart fluttered. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity. I'm interested in learning more. Good to hear, Jack said. I'd love to meet with you and discuss how we can move forward. Are you free tomorrow afternoon? Yes, she replied, her voice clear. Great. Come by my office at 2. We'll talk about the next steps. She scribbled down the address, her hand shaking slightly. I'll be there. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Call me Jack. See you tomorrow, Beatrice. The line went dead, and she set the phone down, her hands pressed against her cheeks as a wave of emotion swept over her. Rose was already beside her, squeezing her shoulders. You did it, she whispered. I'm so proud of you. It's just the beginning, Beatrice said, but a smile stretched across her face. For the first time in a long while, the future felt like something she could shape, something she could hold in her hands. The next day, Beatrice stood in front of a sleek office building, her heart pounding. The glass facade gleamed in the sunlight, a reflection of a world she was about to step into. She clutched the strap of her bag tightly, grounding herself. You belong here, she told herself. You earned this, taking a deep breath. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lobby was spacious and modern, with sleek lines and minimalist decor. The receptionist smiled warmly. You must be Beatrice. Jack's waiting for you. She nodded, her feet carrying her forward. The elevator ride was short, but it felt like an eternity. When the doors slid open, she found Jack standing there, his smile genuine. Welcome, he said, ready to get started. Beatrice smiled, the fear fading into determination. I'm ready. Jack's office was modern but surprisingly warm. Sunlight poured through the wide windows, illuminating shelves filled with awards. Framed photos and stacks of sheet music, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint smell of leather from the plush chairs. Come in, Beatrice, Jack said, his voice friendly as he gestured toward a chair across from his desk. Make yourself comfortable. She stepped inside, her fingers brushing the strap of her bag for reassurance. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a sea of buildings that seemed to stretch forever. For a brief moment, the vastness of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she took a deep breath and focused on the here and now. Thank you, she said, sitting down. The leather was soft beneath her, but her back remained straight, her hands folded in her lap. Jack settled into his chair, his eyes sharp but kind. I'm glad you came today. I meant what I said at the gala. You have something special. Beatrice's cheeks warmed. I'm still trying to believe all of this is real, he chuckled. I get that a lot. But believe me, it's real. Talent like yours doesn't come around every day. The question is, what do you want to do with it? Her mind raced. She had dreamed about this moment for so long, but now that it was here, the possibilities seemed both thrilling and terrifying. I want to sing, she said, her voice steady. I want to share my music with the world. Jack nodded. Good. That's the first step now. Here's the reality of it. The music industry isn't easy. It's competitive, demanding, and sometimes cruel. But if you're willing to work hard, I think you can make it. I'm not afraid of hard work, she said without hesitation. I figured as much. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. I want to start by getting you into a studio to record a demo, something that shows off your range and emotion. From there, we'll see about finding you a producer who can help refine your sound. Does that sound like something you'd be interested in? Her heart leapt. Yes, absolutely, he smiled. I thought so. He handed her a folder. Inside, you'll find details about the recording session, dates, times, and what to expect. It's not glamorous, but it's a start. Beatrice took the folder, the weight of it grounding her in reality. This was happening. The dream that had once felt so distant was now a tangible path before her. Jack's voice softened. You're going to face challenges, Beatrice. People will doubt you. They'll judge you for where you came from, for who you are. Don't let them. Your voice is your power." She met his gaze, her own eyes steady. "I've dealt with that my whole life. I'm ready." Jack's smile widened, a spark of pride in his eyes. "That's what I like to hear." As Beatrice stepped out of the office building, the world felt different. The weight of uncertainty had lifted slightly, replaced by the thrilling pressure of opportunity. The folder in her hand felt like a key to a door she hadn't realized she could open. She took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. The sun was high now, casting long shadows on the pavement. She started walking, her feet carrying her toward a future she hadn't dared to believe in before. When she reached the apartment, Rose was waiting by the window, her face lighting up as soon as she saw Beatrice. "How did it go?" her mother asked, rushing to the door. Beatrice held up the folder, a smile breaking across her face. "I have a recording session, Mom. A real one." Tears welled in Rose's eyes, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, sweetheart, I knew you could do it." Beatrice wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tight. "It's just the beginning," she whispered. "But we're getting there." Rose pulled back, her eyes shining. "I never doubted you for a second." They sat together on the worn couch, the sunlight streaming through the window, warming their small living room. Beatrice opened the folder, showing her mother the details, the studio address, the schedule, the instructions. It all felt so official, so real. "What if I mess up?" she asked softly, the fear she hadn't voiced to Jack creeping back in. Rose took her hand. "You won't. And even if you stumble, you'll get back up. You've always gotten back up." Beatrice nodded, the strength of her mother's belief bolstering her own. "I just want to make you proud. You already have." The day of the recording session arrived faster than she expected. Beatrice stood outside the studio, the building a modest brick structure with a sign that read, "Soundwave Productions." Her stomach fluttered with nerves, but she took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of coffee and faintly of old vinyl records. A young woman with headphones around her neck greeted her. "You must be Beatrice. Jack's waiting for you in Studio B." Beatrice nodded and followed her down a hallway lined with posters of artists she didn't recognize. The door to Studio B was slightly ajar, and she could hear the low hum of equipment inside. Jack was there, adjusting a microphone stand. He looked up and smiled. "There you are, ready?" "As I'll ever be." He gestured to the booth. "Go ahead and step in. We'll run through a few takes. Just breathe. Focus on the song, and let it out." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she entered the booth. The walls were padded with soundproof foam, the world outside muffled and distant. The microphone loomed in front of her, a gateway to something she couldn't yet see. She slipped the headphones on, Jack's voice coming through the line. "Whenever you're ready, Beatrice." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The fear was there, coiling in her chest, but beneath it was a deeper strength, a belief forged from years of struggle and resilience. She opened her mouth and began to sing. The first note filled the booth, pure and clear. The song flowed from her like water, carrying her fears away. In that moment, she wasn't just a girl from a struggling family. She wasn't the maid who had been laughed at or underestimated. She was Beatrice Flores, and the world was finally listening. The final note hung in the air. Fading into silence, Beatrice's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She kept her eyes closed, the warmth of the song still lingering in her veins. The silence in the booth felt vast, as though the world held its breath. Then Jack's voice crackled through the headphones. "That was beautiful, Beatrice, absolutely beautiful." Her eyes fluttered open, and she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A slow, relieved smile spread across her face. The fear that had knotted her stomach began to unwind. "Come on out," Jack said warmly. "You need to hear this." She slipped the headphones off and pushed open the booth door. Stepping into the control room, the room was filled with the soft hum of equipment and the glow of screens displaying waveforms of her voice. Jack stood by the mixing board, his face lit with excitement. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I want you to hear what we just captured." Beatrice sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jack pressed a button and the recording played back through the speakers. Her voice filled the room, clear and rich, the raw emotion she'd poured into it resonating in every note. It was strange to hear herself like this, as though she were listening to someone else. The song ended, and the room fell silent again. Jack turned to her, his eyes shining. "You have a gift, Beatrice. There's a raw honesty in your voice that people are going to connect with." Her cheeks flushed. "I never thought I'd hear myself like this." He chuckled. "Well, get used to it. This is just the beginning." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. The studio assistant popped her head in. "Jack, there's someone here to see you. Says he's interested in hearing the new talent." Jack's brow lifted in surprise. "Send him in." Beatrice's stomach tightened. Interested in hearing the new talent. She hadn't expected anyone else to be here. Her fingers twisted together as a tall man in a tailored gray suit walked into the room. His hair was slicked back, and he carried an air of quiet authority. "David," Jack greeted him, shaking his hand. "What brings you by?" "Just curious to see what you've been working on," David replied, his gaze shifting to Beatrice. "Is this her?" "Yes," Jack said, his voice full of pride. "This is Beatrice Flores." David nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I heard the playback through the hallway. You've got something special." "Thank you," Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper. He studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You're going to need guidance. Someone to help you navigate all this." "It's a tough business," Jack stepped in, his tone firm. "She's got me, and I won't let anyone take advantage of her." David nodded. "Good. I just wanted to say you're off to a strong start, Beatrice. Keep going. Don't let the pressure get to you." She swallowed hard, nodding. "I won't." He gave her one last look before turning to Jack. "I'll be in touch." As the door closed behind him, Beatrice let out a shaky breath. "Who was that?" "David Lang," Jack said, his eyes still on the door. "A talent scout for one of the biggest labels in the country." Her eyes widened. "And he liked what he heard." Jack grinned. "He more than liked it. He doesn't show up unless he thinks there's real potential." A thrill shot through her, but it was tempered by a wave of nerves. "This is all happening so fast." "It is," Jack agreed. "But you're ready for it." She nodded, trying to absorb it all. The recording session, the praise, the possibility of a career. Things she had only dared to dream about were suddenly within reach. Jack's voice softened. "Beatrice, this is your chance, but it's going to be hard work, long hours, tough decisions. Are you ready for that?" Her mind flashed to the long days of cleaning, the countless times she'd been dismissed and underestimated. She thought of her mother's tired but unwavering smile, the sacrifices they had both made just to survive. "I've been working hard my whole life," she said, her voice steady. "This is the kind of hard work I want to do." Jack's smile widened. "That's what I was hoping to hear." The sun was beginning to set when Beatrice finally left the studio. The sky was painted in hues of gold and violet, the first stars beginning to blink into view. She clutched the folder Jack had given her, filled with notes, plans, and details about the recording process. As she walked down the street, her steps felt purposeful, driven. She wasn't just drifting through life anymore, surviving day to day. She was moving forward, towards something real. When she reached the apartment, Rose was waiting by the window, her face lighting up the moment she saw Beatrice. "You're home," Rose exclaimed, opening the door. "How did it go?" Beatrice stepped inside, the warmth of their small home wrapping around her like a blanket. She held up the folder, her smile radiant. "It went amazing, Mom. I recorded my first song and a talent scout heard it." Rose's eyes widened. "A talent scout?" "Yes, Jack says this could lead to something big." Tears filled her mother's eyes, and she pulled Beatrice into a tight hug. "Oh, Bea, I'm so proud of you." Beatrice clung to her mother, the exhaustion of the day giving way to joy. "We did it, Mom. We're finally getting somewhere." Rose pulled back, cupping Beatrice's face in her hands. "No matter what happens next, remember how strong you are. This is just the beginning." "I know," Beatrice whispered, "but for the first time, it feels like I'm walking towards something instead of away from it." They sat together on the worn couch, the city's glow filtering through the window. The world outside was still full of challenges, but for the first time, those challenges felt surmountable. Beatrice's future was no longer a distant dream. It was real, and she was ready to face it head-on. The days after the recording session blurred into a rush of hope and hard work. Beatrice spent long hours at the studio with Jack, polishing her songs, learning the intricacies of the recording process, and discovering what it meant to be an artist. Her world, once confined to the walls of the Collins mansion and the cramped apartment she shared with her mother, now felt expansive, limitless. Each evening, she returned home with new stories and new challenges. Her mother listened to every detail, her pride shining through the worry in her eyes. The weight of their struggles hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving towards something brighter. But the world wasn't done with its twists. One afternoon, as Beatrice and Jack wrapped up a session, Jack's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. "Give me a second, Bea," he said, stepping out of the booth. She waited, adjusting her headphones, humming the melody of the song they'd just recorded. The studio was quiet, the hum of the equipment, a familiar background noise, but Jack's raised voice from the hallway pierced through the calm. "What do you mean he's bankrupt?" Beatrice's humming stopped cold. She set the headphones down, her heart pounding. Bankrupt. Jack's footsteps returned, his expression tight. "Bea, you might want to sit down." "What happened?" she asked, dread curling in her stomach. He rubbed a hand through his hair, sighing. "It's Andrew Collins. His company's just filed for bankruptcy, apparently. Some bad investments and risky deals finally caught up to him." Her breath caught. The name felt like a ghost, a specter from a life she'd been trying to leave behind. "Andrew is bankrupt." "Yeah," Jack said, his voice careful. "It's all over the news. The company's falling apart and people are furious. They're calling it one of the biggest failures in years." Beatrice's mind spun. Images of the grand Collins mansion, the glittering chandeliers, the sneering guests. All of it seemed like a distant dream now, a mirage that had finally shattered. "He was always so sure of himself," she said softly, like nothing could touch him. Jack nodded. "That's how it goes sometimes. Pride comes before the fall." She thought of Andrew's cold eyes, his dismissive words, the way he had tried to humiliate her at the gala. Now his empire was crumbling, the very foundation of his confidence pulled out from under him. "I didn't think something like this could happen to someone like him," she admitted. Jack's gaze was steady. "We all face consequences eventually." "Bea, no one's untouchable." That evening, as Beatrice walked home, the news replayed in her mind. She passed a newsstand and paused. The headline screamed from the front page, "Andrew Collins' empire collapses. Millions lost in financial disaster." A photo of Andrew stared back at her, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a haunted look of defeat. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, justice, and a flicker of pity. He had been cruel to her, yes, but she wouldn't wish this kind of fall on anyone. To lose everything, to have your failures broadcast to the world, that was a punishment even he didn't deserve. She sighed and kept walking, the paper's headline fading behind her. She had her own path now, one that didn't involve Andrew or his crumbling world. When she got home, Rose was watching the news. The familiar face of Andrew Collins splashed across the screen. His mansion, once a beacon of his success, was now surrounded by reporters and angry investors. Rose muted the TV as Beatrice walked in. "Did you hear?" Beatrice nodded, setting her bag down. "Yeah, it's all over the city." Her mother's eyes were gentle. "How do you feel about it?" She thought for a moment. "I don't know. I thought I'd feel happy, or at least vindicated, but all I feel is free." Rose smiled softly. "Because you've moved beyond him. His fate doesn't define you." Beatrice sank onto the couch, leaning her head against her mother's shoulder. "Yeah, I guess it doesn't." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally loosening its grip. The Collins mansion, Andrew's contempt, the night of the gala. It all seemed like another life. Beatrice was no longer the girl who scrubbed floors while enduring his ridicule. She was more than that now. The following week, Beatrice was at the studio when Jack walked in, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "What?" she asked, setting down her coffee cup. "Andrew Collins showed up here this morning. He asked to see you." Her stomach twisted. "He came here?" "Yeah. I told him you were busy, but he insisted on leaving a message." Jack handed her a slip of paper. Beatrice unfolded it, her eyes scanning the short note. "I was wrong. I'm sorry. Andrew." She stared at the words, a mix of disbelief and confusion washing over her. For a moment, she pictured him standing in the studio lobby, no longer the powerful man who once looked down on her, but someone broken, humbled. "Do you want to talk to him?" Jack asked, his voice careful. She shook her head slowly. "No, there's nothing left to say." Jack smiled. "That's what I thought." She folded the note and tucked it into her pocket, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of how far she'd come. Andrew's apology didn't change the past, and it wasn't necessary for her future. She had already forgiven him in her own way, not for his sake, but for hers. "Ready to get back to work?" Jack asked, his eyes warm. She nodded, a smile spreading across her face. More than ready. As she stepped into the recording booth, the weight of the past fell away. The microphone in front of her wasn't a weapon or a test. It was a bridge to everything she had worked for. She took a deep breath and let the music guide her. Her voice rose, clear and strong, a testament to resilience, to hope, to freedom, and this time, no one could take it away. The next few months were a whirlwind. Early mornings blended into late nights at the studio, with each session pushing Beatrice to new heights. Jack guided her through the maze of songwriting, recording, and finding her unique sound. It was exhausting, exhilarating work, and Beatrice thrived on it. The songs took shape, each one infused with the raw honesty that had captured Jack's attention in the first place. Ballads about resilience, heartbreak, and hope poured out of her, every note telling a story of struggle and survival. For the first time, she felt like her voice mattered, like her experiences had meaning. Late one evening, after another long recording session, Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "We've got it, B. The album's ready." Her heart skipped a beat. "Really?" "Yeah." He smiled, his eyes crinkling with pride. "It's more than ready. These songs are going to move people." She stared at the track list on the screen. The names of her songs lined up like milestones. Each one represented a part of her journey, a piece of her soul. She was finally ready to share with the world. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement and nerves. Jack's grin widened. "Now, we get it out there. I've already sent the demos to a few people in the industry. There's a lot of buzz. People are curious about you." Beatrice took a deep breath, the reality sinking in. Her music was about to leave the safe confines of the studio and step into the world. It was terrifying and thrilling all at once. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Interviews, photo shoots, and meetings filled her days. Jack's phone buzzed constantly with calls from agents, producers, and media outlets eager to know more about the new voice of authenticity they'd heard about. Her first single, Unbroken, was released quietly one Friday morning. Beatrice and Rose sat together on the worn couch, staring at her phone, watching the song upload to streaming platforms. The simple cover art, a silhouette of Beatrice standing beneath a sunrise, seemed to capture everything she felt. "It's live," she whispered, her hands trembling. Rose squeezed her shoulder. "No matter what happens, you've already won." "Sweetheart." They spent the day waiting, the tension in the apartment palpable. Every notification made Beatrice's heart jump. Then, as the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, the first messages started pouring in. Her song was being shared. People were talking about it. Jack called, his voice buzzing with excitement. "B, it's happening. The song's going viral. The response is incredible." She could barely process the words. Her phone buzzed with comments. "This song speaks to my soul. Her voice is pure emotion. Finally, someone who sings the truth." Tears welled in her eyes. The world was listening. Her voice had broken through. Within days, Unbroken climbed the charts. It wasn't a meteoric rise, but a steady, determined climb. Just like her journey, radio stations picked it up, and soon, her voice was streaming into cars, cafes, and homes across the country. An invitation to perform on a popular talk show followed, the night before. Beatrice lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Doubt crept in. What if she failed? What if she embarrassed herself? Rose's gentle voice broke the silence. "You're going to be amazing. Beatrice turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, her eyes soft. "I'm scared, Mom." "That's because you care," Rose said, walking over and sitting on the edge of the bed. "But you've faced bigger fears than this. You have nothing left to prove to anyone." Beatrice took a shaky breath. "I just want to make you proud." "You already have," Rose whispered, pulling her into a hug. "Now go make yourself proud." The next day, the bright lights of the TV studio felt blinding. Beatrice's heart pounded as she stood backstage, the hum of the audience just beyond the curtain. Jack appeared beside her, his smile steady and reassuring. "You ready?" She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yeah, I am." The host's voice boomed through the speakers. "Please welcome the incredible new talent, Beatrice Flores." The curtain lifted, and Beatrice stepped onto the stage, the applause washing over her like a wave. She walked to the microphone, her hands steady. The lights were hot, the faces in the crowd blurred, but she focused on the music. The opening chords of Unbroken filled the air. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the song carry her. Her voice soared, clear and unwavering. She sang of resilience, of refusing to be broken, of finding strength in the darkest moments. The audience was silent, hanging on every note. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, genuine. She opened her eyes to see people standing, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. A wave of emotion swept over her, almost knocking her off balance. She had done it. She had shared her truth, and they had heard her. As she walked off stage, Jack was waiting, his eyes bright. "You were perfect," she laughed. "The sound light and free. It feels like a dream." "It's not," he said. "This is just the beginning." That night, as Beatrice sat in her tiny apartment, the city lights twinkling outside, she felt a deep, quiet joy. The world was changing around her, but she was still herself. The girl who had cleaned floors, who had faced ridicule and doubt, was now a singer whose voice touched hearts. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "You were incredible. I'm sorry for everything. Andrew." She stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it. His apology was too late, and she didn't need it. She leaned back, letting the quiet of the night wash over her. Her journey had been hard, but every step had led her here. She was Beatrice Flores, unbroken, unstoppable, and this was only the beginning. The days blurred into a whirlwind of activity, and Beatrice barely had a moment to breathe. Her single, Unbroken, continued its steady climb up the charts, and her face began to appear everywhere. On social media, news articles, and music blogs, fans sent messages of gratitude and admiration, sharing how her music had touched their lives. For the first time, Beatrice felt seen, not as a maid or an outsider, but as an artist. But with success came the harsh light of scrutiny. Her past, once hidden in the shadows of obscurity, was now dragged into the open for all to see. Interviews mentioned her humble beginnings, her mother's struggles, and her work as a housekeeper in the Collins mansion. Some painted her story as one of inspiration and triumph. Others weren't so kind. Headlines started to twist her journey. From maid to music star, is Beatrice Flores just a flash in the pan? Rags to riches or just another Cinderella story? Andrew Collins' former maid climbs the charts. But for how long? Beatrice scrolled through the articles late at night, the glowing screen of her phone illuminating her tired face. She knew she shouldn't let the negativity get to her, but each headline felt like a thorn, pricking the confidence she'd fought so hard to build. The worst sting came from the whispers that her success was somehow tied to Andrew Collins' downfall. Online forums buzzed with conspiracy theories that she had sought revenge, that she had used her story to humiliate him. She threw her phone onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. Why can't they just see the music? Rose, who had been folding laundry, looked up. "B, what's wrong?" Beatrice shook her head, her voice tight. "They think I'm using Andrew's failure to promote myself. They're making it sound like I planned all of this, like I'm just some bitter maid who got lucky." Rose walked over, sitting beside her daughter and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You know that's not true. The people who matter know that too. But it hurts," Beatrice whispered. "I worked so hard for this. I just want people to see me for who I am, not where I came from." Her mother squeezed her gently. You can't control what people say, Bea. You can only control how you respond to it. Your music speaks louder than their words. Beatrice took a shaky breath, leaning into her mother's embrace. I'm just so tired. Mom, I know, sweetheart, but you're stronger than this, and you're not alone. The next morning, Beatrice walked into the studio with her shoulders squared and her jaw set. Jack was already there, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up and frowned when he saw her expression. You okay, Bea? She nodded. Yeah, I've decided I'm not going to let the noise get to me. I didn't get here by accident. I worked for this, and I'm going to keep working. Jack's face broke into a smile. That's the spirit. Look, the industry is full of opinions. Some of them are going to be ugly, but the only voice that really matters is yours. She took a deep breath. Then let's get to work. They spent the day recording a new song, one that felt like a response to the doubts swirling around her. The lyrics were sharp, defiant, a reminder that she had earned her place through grit and determination. When she stepped out of the booth, her muscles ached, but her spirit felt lighter. Jack grinned. That was fire, Bea. They're going to hear you loud and clear. A week later, she performed the new song, Earned It, at a live concert in the heart of the city. The theater was packed, the energy electric. As she stepped onto the stage, the roar of the crowd washed over her, a wave of support that drowned out the doubts and negativity. She gripped the microphone, scanning the faces in the audience. Young women, older men, mothers holding their daughters' hands, people who saw a piece of themselves in her story. Her heart swelled. The music started, and she let the song pour out of her. The lyrics were a declaration. They said I'd never make it, never rise, but I built this bridge with my own hands and my own cries. No crown of gold, no glass slippers gift, just a heart that won't quit, and a dream I won't drift. The chorus soared, raw and unfiltered. I earned it. Every step, every scar, every whispered doubt that tried to pull me apart. I earned it. Through the nights, through the fight. You can't take away what's burning bright. As she finished, the crowd erupted in cheers, some standing, others wiping tears from their eyes. Beatrice stood there, breathless, her chest rising and falling, the energy of the moment vibrating in her bones. Backstage, Jack met her with a grin. Beatrice, that was incredible. You just silenced every critic out there. She laughed, a sound full of relief and joy. Good. I wasn't singing for them. Anyway, he nodded. And that's why you're going to keep rising. That night, as Beatrice and Rose sat together in the quiet of their apartment, the city's glow filtering through the window, Beatrice felt something shift inside her. The fear of failure, the weight of other people's opinions, they no longer held her captive. Her journey hadn't been a fairy tale. There were no magic wands or enchanted carriages, just hard work, resilience, and the quiet belief that she deserved a place in the world. She turned to her mother, their hands clasped together. We're finally here, Mom. Rose smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. And you earned every bit of it. Beatrice nodded, the truth of those words settling deep in her heart. The sun hung low in the sky as Beatrice stepped onto the balcony of her new apartment. The city spread out before her, alive with the hum of traffic and the glow of endless lights. It was a far cry from the cramped space she and her mother once called home. The hardwood floors, the sunlight streaming through the large windows, and the peaceful quiet were all reminders of how far she'd come. Her debut album, Unbroken, had been released to critical acclaim. Reviews praised its honesty, its raw emotion, and the strength of her voice. Fans flooded social media with messages about how her music had inspired them to keep going, to rise above their own struggles. Beatrice's story was no longer just hers. It had become a beacon for others. She leaned on the balcony railing, her fingers tracing the cool metal. The journey had been grueling, filled with uncertainty and challenges, but she had made it through. She had earned every step. A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. Lost in your own world again. She turned to see her mother, Rose, standing in the doorway with a warm smile. The lines on her face seemed softer now, the weight of years of struggle finally easing. She carried a tray with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, the steam rising in gentle curls. Beatrice smiled, just thinking about everything. Rose handed her a mug and joined her at the railing. They stood side by side, the silence comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. "You've come so far," Rose said quietly. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Beatrice took a sip, the warmth spreading through her chest. "I am. I never thought I'd get here." Her mother nodded, her eyes shimmering. "You worked for this, Bea. No one handed it to you, and no one can take it away." They watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted with streaks of gold and lavender. The city's noise seemed distant, almost like a song playing softly in the background. Just then, Beatrice's phone buzzed on the table behind them. She picked it up and saw a text from Jack. "You've been nominated for Best New Artist." Her breath caught. She read the message twice, her heart pounding. "Mom, I've been nominated for Best New Artist." Rose's eyes widened, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "Oh, sweetheart. I knew it. I always knew it." Beatrice's hands trembled as she set the phone down. The nomination wasn't just an acknowledgement of her talent. It was a recognition of her journey, of every moment she had fought to keep going. The girl who once cleaned floors, who had been laughed at and underestimated, was now standing on the edge of something she hadn't even dared to dream of. Her mother's voice pulled her back. "What are you thinking, Bea?" Beatrice looked out at the horizon, the glow of the city lights blending with the stars above. "I'm thinking about the future, about what's next." "You'll keep singing," Rose said softly. "You'll keep sharing your truth, and no matter how far you go, you'll always have your feet on the ground." Beatrice smiled. "Because of you, Mom, you kept me grounded." They embraced, the warmth of the hug more comforting than any award or applause, for all the changes in her life. This, the bond they shared, remained the same. It was the foundation on which she had built everything. As they pulled apart, Rose wiped her tears and chuckled. "You know, we should celebrate, but maybe with something fancier than hot chocolate this time?" Beatrice laughed, the sound light and free. "How about we start with dinner at that place you've always wanted to try?" Rose's eyes sparkled. "You mean the one with the view of the whole city?" "Yes," Beatrice said. "It's time we celebrated more than just surviving." Her mother nodded, a smile breaking across her face. "I'd like that." A week later, Beatrice found herself on the red carpet at the music awards ceremony. Cameras flashed, and reporters called out her name, but she stayed focused, her hand wrapped tightly around her mother's. Rose walked beside her, elegant in a simple navy blue dress, her smile radiant with pride. Jack met them at the entrance, his grin wide. "You ready for this?" Beatrice took a deep breath, the noise and lights fading into the background. "I've been ready." Inside the venue, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Artists she had once only seen on TV were now just a few feet away, offering her nods of respect and admiration. She took her seat, her heart hammering in her chest. When the category for Best New Artist was announced, the room seemed to hold its breath. The presenter's voice rang out. "And the award for Best New Artist goes to Beatrice Flores." The room erupted in applause, but Beatrice barely heard it. She turned to her mother, tears in her eyes. Rose's face was lit with joy, her hands covering her mouth. They hugged tightly before Beatrice made her way to the stage. The weight of the moment settling on her shoulders, she took the microphone, the golden award heavy in her hand. The lights were blinding, the audience a sea of faces. "I never thought I'd be here," she began, her voice trembling. "I was just a girl trying to make a living, trying to survive. But music gave me a voice. It gave me hope, and I want to thank everyone who believed in me. My mother, Jack, my friends, and to anyone who feels like they don't matter, like they're invisible. Your voice matters. You matter." The applause thundered as she stepped back, tears streaming down her face. She had done it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. As she left the stage, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a journey she was ready to embrace, one note at a time.